Hello everyone, this is the SIG cluster lifecycle meeting on Tuesday the 6th of June 2017. How's everyone today? Noisy apparently. Okay, seems to have stopped on its own. Cool, so there are just 3 agenda items for today. The first 2 were just from a topic that I discussed. I had a catch up with Lucas earlier. Lucas is up and running with us again and working on various things. I think he's going to join the meeting in a minute. The first 2 were just to flag that there are a couple of issues that are currently stopping kubeadm CI going green, and they're linked to in the notes. So if necessary, I think the first one has already been approved, but it'd be great to get some input on the second one. I believe the first one is already in the submit queue.
It has merged since we talked.
Cool. Hey, Lucas.
So, hi.
And then the second one was just a call out to please get some eyes on if necessary. There's also a docs PR up from Jacob. Thank you, Jacob, for that. I left a review comment. Don't know if Jacob's on the call.
Yeah. Thanks, Luke. And at this point, it's just a skeleton overview of the process for upgrading. It's not consumer friendly. It's not very user friendly at this point. It's just like do this, do this, this. We assume you know what you're doing so that other developers could help us test the upgrade process. Lucas and I have gotten in a few PRs to make kubeadm init item potent, so you can actually use it for upgrades. And it sounds like one of Lucas's PRs just got merged in, but I'm going to try to create candidate debs and RPMs and link them from the guide so people can just download them before the next candidate release is cut and start testing the instructions early.
Yeah, I have 2 more PRs to be merged. I think you have 1 or 2. Then we also need a control plane from late yesterday, something for it to work. Mike had some changes on the control plane side, API server, RBAC rules that are required for kubeadm, the CSR approval flow to work. But
got it. Okay.
The next beta should just work. And when my node authorizer PR gets in, the kubeadm CI should turn green.
Good stuff. Having green CI, sign of a healthier project. That's great. Cool. So thank you, Jacob and Lucas, for that. So Jacob, are you looking for feedback? Are you looking for testers on those docs changes at the moment versus actually trying to get the docs change merged? Or do you think we should get the docs change merged and then improve it?
Right, yeah. So at this point, it was not written to be very, it's not polished at all. So it was mainly to get other testers testing it, but it's a little hard for people to test it right now because we don't have debs and RPMs cuts since there have been changes since the last beta. So it might be worthwhile to just wait until we cut the next beta. I'll check the schedule to see how far out that's scheduled to be. But if anyone wants to build them locally, you can do that. Otherwise, I don't know how difficult it'll be to cut a candidate for the control plane and all of the debs and RPMs, but I'll take a swag at it. But maybe at this point, just hold off until the next beta and everything should just work as Lucas said.
I can give it a whirl because I have a weird auto-configured setup where I build everything from scratch. So.
Oh, awesome.
Nice. And beta should be tomorrow. That's great. Cool. Yeah, and I mean, Sounds good. I mean, I just took a quick look at the docs, and apart from all the bits that say like "don't," this is a work in progress, and the to-dos, I do think that having this in would obviously be better than not having it in. And when it is ready to, when it is a bit more polished, I think we should link from the KubeADM guide to this guide, just maybe with a banner at the top or something. Or just something in bold at the top of the KubeADM guide to say, if you want to upgrade, then see this new guide.
Really sure.
Cool. Awesome. Okay, Simon is up next.
Hey, Luke, I put a note on the first one. Lucas was asking for feedback on the PRs. The second PR, Don, the release manager for 1.7, said that we either need to go through the exception process if we think that is a feature, or we need to qualify it as not a feature for the 1.7 release branch. So we should decide what that is. The exception process nominations are due by tomorrow. So if we do think it needs to go through the exception process, we need to do that ASAP.
Yeah, I was gonna comment on that. Well, it was the original PR is somewhere in the queue as well, and Mike did that one. However, it was he just set the node authorizer arguments unconditionally. So it broke 1.6 clusters, or it would have broken 1.6 clusters. So I asked him to just move that commit from the PR. That was LGTM'd in time for code freeze. Let me see if I can find the right number.
Yeah, his PR, Jordan added a do not merge label to it, so it's not right now.
So
exactly.
Okay, so so the argument here would be that we actually prevented something to go in because it would have been buggy, so that we could actually prefix it before it went in. If we had been, if we just slammed that in, then we could have said, well, now we're doing a bug fix. But we were trying to be more careful, and so therefore it slowed down actually getting that thing in. Is that kind of our argument here?
Yeah, exactly. And so it was the code was LGTM'd as is before the code freeze, but then I found a bug that I said I could fix before we merged this in the KubeADM part of it, and then I sent another PR that's due to be merged now, and so yeah, that's the argument, and also it is kind of a bug fix as well, because without this, the KubeADM CI is red, and with this, it will probably go green.
So Dawn has a comment in there saying that the reason why it wasn't LGTM'd before the freeze, but there was a previous version of this that is pretty much the same that was LGTM'd before the freeze, and we're just trying to rebase it on top of that other fix.
Exactly, yeah. So I don't know really how to put it gracefully in a comment, but yeah, that's the story.
It may be worthwhile for somebody to sort of just ask Dawn, which way she prefers to go, and sort of explain the situation to her, and see if she would rather have it be an exception process or just treat it as a feature that was LGTM before, but in a different PR.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't have any preference.
Somebody want to take the lead on that? Lucas, do you have time to do that, to try and get that done like today? It needs to be rebased too.
Yeah, it had a commit from the first PR of mine, so I just need to remove that commit, and then it will.
Okay, and then you're cool with talking with Dawn?
Let me see if she's on Slack. Yeah, she's green on Slack, so yeah, it may work to explain. Yeah.
If you need to hand that off to somebody else, feel free to pick somebody friendly like me or Luke or or Tim. I'm going to volunteer Tim here, and yeah, and we'll help you out. But just positive handoff if you can't drive it to conclusion. Okay.
Yeah. Cool.
Sounds good.
Awesome. Good. Cool. So the next agenda item is from Simon. Simon, are you here?
Yeah. Hi guys. First time joining here. I'm from the SIG service catalog and working for IBM. Currently, we have a need to identify one cluster from another, and there's really no good way to do it. We don't want to do it by IP addresses because that potentially could change. So we put in a proposal. I have the link right here in my agenda, where we try to save a cluster ID, which actually a UUID we generate on controller startup, into config map. But there's a lot of discussion about that, and one major discussion is about how config map are mutable, and we really don't want something like a cluster ID to be mutable. So we're looking for other solution, and one suggestion that came was to use the cluster name field that's already defined in the code, but it's not currently being set by anything, or looks like it's not being used at all. So one question, or maybe more than one question. The first question we have is like, is the cluster name suitable to be populated with something that we can identify the cluster with? I was referred to this SIG. They say this is probably the right SIG for discussion like this. Yeah, awesome. So I don't know the cluster name. I'm not sure if you guys know which one I'm talking about. I can find the link.
Is this in the kube config, the cluster name? I mean,
no, I think it's in the object meta. It was added by some guys who are working on.
Actually, I have the link, so I'm gonna paste it into the chat. It's within the object meta.
Object meta. So this is going to be this is on pretty much every object.
Correct.
Okay.
So from the comment that's on the in the code, it says the field cannot be. It will be ignored if it's set in create and update. So it sort of make it immutable. Make it immutable. I could be wrong. And it looks like it's not being used right now. And I kind of track back to the PR that put this field in. And the original PR says it's either to identify federated cluster or just individual cluster. So it's kind of broad, the usage. And I honestly not too sure like if this is the right place for it, but it could be.
So, okay, so I think there's two issues here. So the first issue is, how do you actually set the cluster ID itself, and where is that discoverable across the cluster? And then the second issue is that, do we change the API machinery such that that cluster ID gets stamped into every resource, similar to, say, the UID of the resource itself, or the self link, or even namespace and resource version, because these are all part of that object meta that users aren't allowed to change and that the system changes, right? So I think if we come up with a unique ID for a cluster, stamping that into the cluster name is probably okay. I think it's a little bit wacky because there's a lot of custom code that folks will write to actually take resources out of the API server and sort of strip cluster specific stuff from them. And this is going to be one of those that they're going to have to change to be able to strip. And so, like, for instance, we'd want to make sure that kube control, kube control get there's a option on there that says export. So if I do kube control get and I do an export, then that it should actually ideally go ahead and like strip this cluster name from resources as I get them. And so that's the type of thing that we'd want to make sure gets fixed up as part of this. And the API machinery folks would probably have a much better idea of where and when and how some of this stuff happens. That being said, how do we actually go through and set the cluster ID is another question. And then what is the canonical place to walk up to a cluster and say, tell me what your cluster ID is? Setting this can be done with a new option in the component config, and that's not totally crazy. In terms of where you go up and get this, we publish a bunch of information about the cluster in for at least for kubeadmin, we do it with the kube public, system info config map. I think the idea was that if we can get folks to agree, eventually that becomes more standard, and the cluster itself updates that with information about the cluster as things change. So I think in terms of setting that, a new component config option for the API server is not crazy. In terms of publishing that to anybody who wants to walk up, doing that in the kube public cluster info is not crazy. And then in terms of setting this on every object, I think that's probably a little bit of a stickier issue in terms of compatibility, because it's going to be a new immutable resource that lots of folks won't be expecting. So I would break it down that way.
Yeah, so in terms of setting it on the config map, Joe, one of the arguments was that it shouldn't be mutable. And if it's in a component config for the API server, this controller manager, that implies that it's mutable, right? Because it's easy for someone to change that config map and then update that thing through the deployment.
So one narrow solution is to look at like the UID of the kube system namespace, which is in practice immutable, because once you delete that, you're basically effed. But
it's not crazy, yeah.
I think that this probably landed on our plate because we have a bunch of other things. Like I saw Tim was asking about CIDRs, and I think like the notion of the config map holding things is a good one. It might even eventually not be a config map, right? And I think so the UID will be immutable on something, and we could do kube system, or we could say it's that config map, which might one day be an API object. If we don't have it be the namespace, then if we switch it from a config map to an API object, it will change.
In terms of like the config map and there's all sorts of things you can do by walking up to a Unix system and like deleting like the kernel image, and then the machine no longer boots, right? Just because you can do something to screw up a machine doesn't mean, we can set the appropriate RBAC rules so that we just say don't do that. You're going to end up with a horked machine. If you want to screw up your cluster, you can screw up your cluster. At the end of the day, everything's mutable because somebody could go behind your back and muck with etcd. So as long as we provide some guardrails there, I don't think that this is totally crazy.
Right. Like one advantage of using the config map is other than the cluster ID, there will be other cluster information or other cluster configuration information that people might want to stick in there. Doing it with cluster name kind of forbidden that. So that's another argument.
So I would say I like Justin's idea of taking the UID of the kube system. The only problem with that is you don't know what that's going to be until after the cluster is up and running. So there's going to be a time period where the cluster is kind of running, but you don't you don't know from the outside when you're starting the cluster what that UID is. And so I think having a way such that you can actually, have that UID set very, very, very early, I think might be something that would be a good benefit here. So like I said, setting it, publishing it, and then setting it in the object meta, those are all, I think, separable issues. The object meta thing seems like it's, very separable. Like if we don't do the cluster name thing in every object, it's not the end of the world. That can always come later, and that's, I think, useful for federation, I'm sure, but that's not necessarily something that is necessary for us to at least start getting a cluster ID plumbed through in some way.
Yeah, that's helpful.
So Justin, what do you think? I mean, like, I like the idea of using the UID on Cube System, but there is that window of time that worries me. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends on what it's going to be used for, right? I mean, I don't know. Like the minute we say you can predefine the UID, it won't be unique anymore.
It's true. I mean, one of the things that I think you'll use it for is to actually, you know, identify a cluster in some sort of future version of kubeconfig, right? Just to make sure that you're talking to the cluster that you think you're talking to. So that's going to be one thing. I can imagine that as we're writing out structured logs, we might want to append it to structured logs for pretty much everything that's going on, so that you can actually mix structured logs from multiple clusters into one analysis system and be able to sort by cluster.
We're also having a related debate in like cloud, which I think is sort of relevant to bring up here, which is like if you shut down and if you suspend a node and you bring it back up, is it the same node? And is it the same node if you change the instance type and all those sort of things? So I guess the question is, in this case, like if I back up and restore a cluster on a different IP, different private key, everything different, but I put the same things on it and I feel like it's the same, like should that be the same cluster or not from your point of view in sorry, I forget, SIG, in the, what's the project again? Service catalog.
Yeah.
In our point of view, there will be the same cluster, and we would like to have the same cluster ID.
So that makes it, I mean, that makes it trickier, right? It means that is an etcd level backup. Only an etcd level backup will keep the UID on the kube system namespace. Yeah,
that brings another question. So our requirement is like, we would like the operator not to have to manually set the UID. It's an option for them to do it, but like in the case that one is not being set, then the system can probably generate one.
Yeah.
And then we want that to be unique. So like the first, let's say API server come up will generate one, and we need that to be stored somewhere. So other API that comes up wouldn't make another one, and then now we have two.
I mean, ideally that gets stored in etcd. I mean,
right. So we're just gonna start. Okay. Yeah, that's.
Again, I don't think it's. Okay, so a couple of things. If you know Linux machines, the closest thing we have to the Linux thing in Linux is kind of the SSH host key. Is the biggest thing that we have, like in kind of the host name a little bit too, but like in terms of unique identifier in Linux, it's the host key.
There is a systemd has added a machine ID.
Has it really? Okay, I didn't know. Yeah, of course it did. I was going to say Windows has this idea of like a machine ID that's baked in at a pretty fundamental level, and to reset that, you essentially have to sysprep the machine, which makes creating Windows images on clouds a total pain in the ass.
Yeah.
So I'm just trying to like think about sort of like analogous things that relate to this.
Yeah, machine IDs on Linux are a bit awkward because they're often, well, there's like 3 different places you can look for one on different distros. And anyway, if we're looking for analogies, then the analogy is that it's complicated.
Okay, so Here's my idea in terms of what should happen here is that this gets sets into a config map. We have some controller in the API server that looks for this. If it sees that it changes, it just starts crashing with a loud message because you're not supposed to change the thing, right? And so in terms of where this gets stored, that's the canonical place that it gets stored. And if an API server boots up and there's not one of those config maps, it'll go ahead and create one. If it doesn't, if it's there's a parameter to initialize it to something, I think that's sort of the design doc that needs to be had here.
Yeah, I will say that a lot of the things we're discussing have already sort of been proposed and hashed out on the issue. Okay. So we might want to.
I haven't read the issue.
Have people read that issue and put their comments there, so we can also loop in the other people that are already discussing these things instead of trying to hash it out right now in terms of.
I will add to my list.
For our usage with kubeadm and this config map, are we going to try to promote that to a proper API type, or what is the
That's one of the proposals in the issue.
I think I'm sorry to promote the system info, the cluster info thing to a real API type.
Yeah, that was one suggestion on that.
Yeah, Clayton told me not to do that. He yelled at me about that.
It was not Clayton that proposed that on the issue.
Okay.
Well, I mean, I think, what is the alternative Clayton's proposing?
Oh, I don't know. No. I mean, at the time when I was doing all the Bootstrap stuff, he really pushed me away from adding new API types and using config maps and secrets and keeping this stuff lightweight.
Yeah, I feel like config maps are the equivalent of annotations, where it's like, it's very, very convenient to not have to go through the API stuff, but it will bite us very hard later on.
Yeah, I think at the time I was all about adding a new API type, and Clayton sort of convinced me the other way.
Well, the
I
can
think
also sort of prove your use case that then you go turn it into an API type later once you
That's true.
understand it.
Yeah.
Right.
But an alpha API type is nothing. So.
Okay. Shall we just maybe put a pin in this and have folks who are interested in commenting bits on the issue? Is that kind of where we're at?
Yeah, I guess what's
I don't know if we
the
can give it
urgency on this? Is this we're hoping to get this into 1.8? Is this we need a design doc? I mean, I'm curious where we are in the process here. And what
well, originally we want this as soon as possible, but it seems like it's not going to go into.
Can I make a suggestion? There is a short-term thing, which is we can say today use the UID on kube system. That will give you your unique ID, and then when we build something that does it properly, we will seed it from the UID on kube system. If there isn't, I don't know, one already or something.
Yeah, that's what I was going to recommend.
Yeah, instead of the API server generating something random to shove in the config map, it can just take the UID of kube system and stick it in the config map. And then
Which is random.
I worry about ordering there. I got to be honest. This kind of scares me a little bit, because there's going to be like this time when there's no config map, but we're going to want to create objects. And if we do something like the cluster name as part of the object meta, then how do we create kube system if we actually don't have that and we need to actually set that into kube system?
I don't think we should shove it on every single object. I think we should just.
Well, that's what the object meta would be. I mean, that's what that.
Why wouldn't we just stick it in the cluster config map though, and say?
Well, I think the idea is that if you go through and if you get something from a cluster, you want part of like that meta of that object is which cluster is that thing in, right? And so the cluster name thing that's in object meta, I believe the intent there is, at least if I'm reading the comment right, was to actually have that set on every object, so that if you persist this in other contexts, you actually get the full cluster ID that includes the cluster name, the resource name, the UID, all the everythings.
Mm. I read that as one proposal, and I think Tim caveated it by saying this might be crazy.
Okay.
Which didn't make it sound like he was necessarily in favor of that.
Well, I think it's odd that we have cluster name and object meta, but nobody's using it. Why the hell would we add that there if nobody's using it? But that's historic questioning, not
yes, yeah,
not necessarily germane with the discussion now.
Yeah.
Okay, well, why don't we propose the kube system namespace ID seed on the issue, and then invite people to comment on that, rather than stating it as like gospel at this point in this meeting. If we get like some good feedback on that, and people don't see any big issues with it in the future, then it means that Simon and his colleagues in the other SIG could potentially have a useful answer sooner.
I will read through the issue. That's what I can promise you.
Cool.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, great. Well, thanks, Simon, and thanks for coming to join our SIG with that question. Lucas has interjected an issue. Lucas, do you want to speak to this?
Yeah, just so I've said it. I may have mentioned it already. So there's Mike's PR that enables the node authorizer for GCE and GKE, and then my KubeADM PR that's similar to that one. And basically, KubeADM in 1.7 will always use the node authorizer and the node admission plugin for security. And when upgrading, this will mean that the system, currently there's a cluster role binding that binds the system nodes group to the system node cluster role, which means that every cert in the system nodes organization will have read access to every secret and so forth. And the node authorizer and node admission plugin doesn't have any effect if this cluster role binding isn't revoked or somehow modified to not allow this usage. So when upgrading, this will mean that the subject is removed from that cluster role binding. And yeah, so I've spoken with Jordan about this in SIG-auth, like the preferable way to go. And it's there are comments in that PR as well. And yeah, just so that I've mentioned it and everybody's aware of things. And
so just as a point of order, because I saw you put in those PRs and I understand the reasoning and logic behind it, but I was blind to it throughout the release cycle for 1.7 because we didn't have like labeling specified for issues we wanted to address on kubeadm for 1.7. So I knew that this existed. I did not know, because there's so many things going on, I have so many issues to track and follow, that we were going to try and tackle this as part of this release and that the default would be updated. Was there any root, just so I have like history here, was there any root issue for kubeadm that pointed back to a 1.7 milestone or something like that? So just for my own edification, so as for the next release cycle, as we start to do these things and start to get more structured with how we target items for a release, there's traceability for the release cycle. Because we do this as part of SIG scheduling. We always have like, these things are part of the release. There's no ambiguity, right?
To be honest, nothing has been tracked in the repo to really kind of for 1.7. I did this triage, or I labeled the right issues with 1.6 that were going in and like set the milestone, everything. So we had a clear historic view of how things turned out. As far as I know, that wasn't done pretty much at all. In the end here, I saw when you got write access, you started doing this, and that's great. But before that, nothing really.
I think as this kind of I think as it leads into 1.8, talking about 1.8 stuff, I want to start making sure that we tackle and label things for 1.8, just so we have a known list of features that we want to work on, and we can actually federate and lay out or delegate folks who are on the call who want to contribute some of these new items too. So that way it's a little more structured for how we execute.
Yeah. I think
totally agree.
I mean, so Tim, I think just candidly, I think that this whole SIG was under-resourced for 1.7. I think it was just a perfect storm of, lots of other priorities coming in. And so there wasn't as much focus as I think we'd like in terms of getting work done at all, let alone tracking it appropriately.
I'm not.
I mean, what's that?
I'm not laying blame or anything.
I'm just trying to explain that's, and the node authorizer stuff was mostly driven by Jordan out of SIG-auth, and I think it's just it's more of an opportunistic thing to turn it on for kubeadmin, since kubeadmin has, been sort of bleeding edge with RBAC up until now. And so, so I think it's definitely agree with you that moving forward into 1.8, as we get, more focus on moving kubeadmin forward and other stuff in the SIG forward, we should definitely be tracking that.
yeah, as we have more folks working on things, or folks at all, it's we we should really use these milestones and so forth.
Cool. Well, I think that leads us nicely on to probably spending the last 23 minutes of the call on 1.8 planning. So, Robert, do you want to lead this?
Sure. I did want to mention before we start going through the doc, because I noticed that the doc has lots of items in it and lots of people's names next to them, that one of the things I felt that didn't go very well with 1.7 is we signed up for sort of too many things and didn't put enough people on the things we signed up for. And we need to keep in mind that signing up for making something doesn't just mean writing a little bit of code. It means writing code. It means writing tests. It means adding end-to-end tests. It means making sure those stay green. It means adding documentation. And it would be probably better to have more people work on fewer things than to sort of spread ourselves really thin, have every person pick up one thing and not quite get it done. So I would encourage us to try to be very circumspect in terms of what we think we're going to shoot for, and to sort of under-promise and over-deliver, and like make sure we actually nail everything we sign up for, rather than claiming we're going to sign up for a whole bunch of stuff, having other SIGs or other people see our document and think, wow, all this stuff's going to get done, and then being sort of disappointed at the end of 1.8, as I feel like we are at the end of 1.7 with the sort of state that we end up in. So I just want to sort of set the stage with that before we start walking to the doc, because there is quite a lot of stuff in the doc.
The things I put my name next to, I'm gonna be really focused at delivering those at least.
The one thing I don't see in the doc as I look through it, I just scanned it real quick, is there are a fair number of issues coming in. To have somebody who can triage the issues, we talked about this kind of at the leadership summit, was to have somebody who could potentially triage the inbound requests and potentially address them, so that way other folks can focus on executing too. Because there is a fair number of bugs that actually exist, some of which could be considered as bugs, whether they're just minor configuration knobs or whatnot. I think that's to be determined. But there's nowhere on the list is like getting the backlog of kubeadm so it's like level or down from this next release cycle. Because right now it's growing this way.
And similarly, making sure our tests stay green, right? And we are actually testing the right configurations.
Yep.
Yeah. Last week, I was going through all the kubeadm issues. I don't think you were here, Tim.
No, I was out last week, but I got the emails.
Cool.
I got all the emails. which is why I'm commenting on it right now, actually.
I think we also need to be careful to make sure that we're looking beyond just kubeadmin for this stuff. I think a lot of the scenarios are driven by kubeadmin, but these parts have independent utility. And so, there's going to be other issues that people see through use cases that are not coming through kubeadmin that, hopefully they'll see it as they start using these different facilities in different ways. So, wow.
Yeah, totally agree. That was my focus for the day.
All right. So I guess with that intro, let's walk through the doc. We have about 20 minutes left. So the first thing is getting Bootstrap tokens up to beta. And I don't know if people have sort of self-signed up for these things, or if I don't know if somebody went through and assigned other people. But I would also like to make sure that people whose names are next to these are actually committing to getting them done with all of the requisite items that I had mentioned at the beginning. So
yes, I will do the EDE test this cycle. I will find time.
Yeah, and I'll speak to Sigurd as well. Actually, there was somebody from CoreOS asking for this. He said they'd be happy to enable this functionality already in 1.7. Or he asked if he could enable it in 1.7, but I said it's unfortunately still alpha, but we might get some help from there as well.
Play devil's advocate a little bit and ask, why is this important for us to do this cycle? I think we need to justify each of the things we're doing with some rationale of why are we doing this and not something else. So why are we doing this one? Joe, Lucas?
This is a pretty straightforward migration. So basically, it's mostly writing ETE tests and flipping from alpha to beta. I don't see any major changes coming for this stuff.
Right, you're explaining why it's easy, not why it's important, though.
So what I would say is that you know this is a key part of the KubeAdmin experience. There's a general goal to actually get KubeAdmin to GA because there's a lot of folks who just won't use it unless it's GA, and so making sure that we're willing to support this part of the process.
Okay, that was much better. Thank you, Joe.
Value delivered, not how easy it is, Lucas.
Yes. All right, so the next one is better add-on management. I assume Mike here is Mike Denise. I'm not sure if he signed up for that or if he got signed up for that. So I think Justin has started working on this in 1.7. And then Justin, so do you want to speak to this one?
Yeah, I'm also going to continue working on this. I have been distracted by other things like test flakes, but this is probably going to have to involve a new API type in core, and so is going to be a big design upfront type effort, even if it is going to be alpha and is going to be super minimal. But I believe it is important because add-ons continue to fail. For something that is so easy, add-ons continue to fail in very surprising ways. For example, it turns out in HA clusters, when you do an upgrade, your 1.5 API servers will downgrade your 1.6 things silently behind your back, and we have no fix for that. So there are a lot of like crazy things that make this very, very hard.
So I want to put a point in this also. I think you know, as we look towards taking the API server, the controller manager, the scheduler, and breaking those out into smaller pieces, I don't know if it's going to end up looking like Brian's layer cake or what, but it's very clear that we're gonna see the control plane actually include more components, you know, beyond what we have now. And right now, adding a new binary to that control plane is a total crapshoot because there's just so much variability in terms of how those things get launched and managed, right? So if we can model those as add-ons and get a standard way to do that, then it enables us to actually have more systems processes in some ways that we can actually launch and manage. And this is going to be a multi-release type of thing to get this to the point where people trust it enough for core system stuff. So it's going to be, you know, it's good to get started on it.
Yeah, and I added a couple other notes there too. We need a consistent add-on experience as part of the core Kubernetes, right? That's part of the layered architecture doc. We want that to be the same everywhere. And that also, like you said, Joe, makes it simpler to do things like add the cloud controller manager. You know, if we stick the cloud controller manager as sort of an add-on with component config, then that's really easy to bootstrap in a consistent way.
Yeah, and I would say that this is, I mean, maybe the name add-on is really a bit of a misnomer. I mean, this is more akin to the module system in the kernel. Okay, Tim, you have your hand up. Sorry, man.
I think, isn't this predicated on component config? If we're doing like a strict DAG ordering, in order for us to do some, like if we, in the ideal world where all the add-ons are controlled by some type of controller, right, as part of this routine, doesn't that mean that everything needs to be all the state needs to be stored in etcd for self-hosted-ish pieces?
I can see that. So certainly when I was working on this, a big question was like, what is an add-on, or what is one of these going to look like, so that we know, like, do we need templating, for example? And as you say, like, it seems that the way we are all headed is to say we don't want templating. We want simple manifests where the variability is stored in a component config or a config map or other external API objects which are user editable to varying degrees. And so I think the answer is yes, you are right, but I think we have determined enough that we have decoupled them. In other words, the portion, in order to get there, we'll have to do that bit as well, but the portion that is the add-on manager and the portion that is moving system components to use component config are now separable, because the add-on manager, such as it is, will be very, very simple and only dealing with effectively static manifests and updating them, and,
right,
and not touching your component config.
And some add-ons are already using component config. So kubeproxy already uses it in 1.7 when installed with kubeadmin. I'm trying to push the networking or some of the other SIGs to move their things over to component config also. Like FluentD is starting to use component config. Somebody, I think it was you, Tim, said you'd move the scheduler over to use it in 1.8.
Well, I just sent an email this morning. I want to make sure I solicit the scheduling SIG,
Right.
whether or not they have any objections to it. So I sent an email this morning about this topic exactly. So.
Right. So I think we are moving that direction. I don't think every single thing has to use it to make this work, but certainly sort of new add-ins we're adding, like the Cloud Controller Manager, should start that way.
So I think maybe one way to look at this is that maybe in 1.8, this is something that's in alpha and we use it optionally for current add-ons like DNS and maybe the proxy. And then as it gets proven out and gets used for more system stuff, we'll build confidence in it. And that's sort of one of the gates to going towards beta and beyond. If we do
what other SIGs do, and we say some things are P0, P1, and P2, this would fall underneath the category of P2 if it's alpha then. And you can assign priority relative to the person who's executing on it, right? If it's your precious pet. But as the SIG, it'd be nice to say we are going to deliver these P0 items. We are going to potentially deliver some of these P2 items.
I think that's a really sober way of looking at it too, to be honest. I mean, Mike's time is constrained. I'm not sure this is where it's the best place for him to know.
We certainly wouldn't block the release if this didn't make 1.8, for example.
Yeah.
So I agree that it makes sense to have priorities. Do we want to try and put priorities next to any of the items that we've gone through so far?
There are only two, and that one was just suggested to be a P2 with some agreement, so I stuck that next to that one. Joe and Lucas, why don't you fill in a priority for the first one as we keep moving, because we only have 12 more minutes.
Oh, okay, I'm going to mark that P1.
Okay.
Yeah, P1.
Next
Assumed,
is Cube admin phases and a new API group.
So basically, this is all about making KubeADM usable for COPS and GC and GKey and all the things. It's not a P1, I think. It would be really nice to have, and I made a first shot at it in the 1.6 cycle and got halfway through.
So when we say API group, we're talking for the config file, not necessarily for a network API.
Yeah. No.
So we're using API machinery for on-disk schema, not for, okay. It'd be worthwhile to clarify that here because that seems like a lot less producing a new server-side API.
Client-side /config file, what should I write?
Yeah, call it component config. I mean, I think there's some debate on whether component config should be using the API types like it is. I seem to remember hearing that. I don't know what the latest was on that.
I suggest that we call out items that we think are P0s and then discuss those in the rest of the time that we have.
Yes, so the next one I think I will skip because it has a question mark next to it. If you want to suggest P0s, otherwise I will do so.
Oh, so the question mark was about whether TLS bootstrapping is going to beta or not. That was
to GA, you mean? I think it's already beta, right?
GA, yes.
Well, I will put a shout out for upgrades being P0 because it's not production ready if you can't upgrade it.
I would also put a mark. I don't know whether or not it's actually P0 across all the components, but it's a P0 item that component configs are going to be required. Component config / config maps are going to be required for some items. Eventually, when you start to get other features atop of it, right?
Yeah. So the specific component config to beta is not actually that component config. Like component config is a design pattern that we have using config maps. So that there isn't actually an API group there. We should delete the component config alpha API group, publicize the doc that Mike wrote, and start having other components use it. So that's sort of this section, and then the top part is a delete, right? I mean, this is a strike through.
Makes sense. And yeah, I mean, reliable self-hosting is the way that we decided that we were going to do upgrades depends on reliable self-hosting. It's also a P0.
But the big one there is going to be the checkpointer, but we got buy-in from Don.
Okay.
Well, we can't do, okay, and then you marked HA as P2. We can't really do self-hosting without HA.
It's this weird conundrum. If you have checkpointing, you can't reliably do self-hosting without HA. I wouldn't say can't reliably, but this gets into opinionated territory.
All right, so I'm going to change reliable self-hosting to just self-hosting.
That'll do.
One question about AJ. Are we talking about like real AJ where masters can go up and down and move around, or just multi-master? It's the first goal. Just we can have 3 masters, but they are not. They can't move.
What do you mean by move?
This is kind of a circle here, right? Like there's the static manifest step, but if you wanted to have a self-hosted control plane, right, for high availability, I mean, you get the controller manager and scheduler pretty much for free once you start doing self-hosting and you have checkpointing, right? You just say 2, and you lock on the component or the config map, right? So if they use component configs to start up and they leverage config maps, then you get the locking for free, and you just say 2 with anti-affinity and host, right?
Yeah, I was more meaning the API server.
The API server stuff, I don't know how far we're going to tread down this road, right? Like, I would say we could start putting some of the HA stuff as P1, or it depends on the priority of how we want to do this. Like, it's a circle of features, right? Yeah. Where they're all dependent upon each other.
We have to, we have to spiral then, start from the inside, make little improvements, and I don't know. So my understanding of it, based on the discussions we've had previously about this, is that part of the HA story is like how do the kubelets find the API servers, for example, and keep those lists up to date over time. And I would be happy with saying that we want to solve that eventually, but we don't have to solve that in time for 1.8.
I'm fine saying we don't want to solve that bit for 1.8.
You are.
Yeah, or at least that particular bit. We can solve the other pieces.
So if we self-hosted into particular nodes, right? That is a step in the right direction. It's not where we want to end up, but that at least gets us progress so that we're no longer writing stuff to disk. It's actually, like, if you lose a machine, you still have to go through and muck with stuff, but it's at least moving us in the right direction towards being able, then we can solve the dynamic discovery problem and updating stuff as a separable issue from that.
Yeah, exactly. So that was my intended point, that we're not targeting design or implementation of dynamic discovery of API servers. I mean, hit one and...
So we have static manifests, we have pinned self-hosting, and then we have floating self-hosting, right? And I think the floating self-hosting introduces discovery problems that don't exist with the pinned self-hosting.
Yeah.
That seems reasonable to me.
Okay.
And so in time for 1.8, we're targeting pinned self-hosting?
Yeah.
Does that sound reasonable, Tim?
I like the nomenclature too. It makes it easier. Because right now self-hosting is like, what is self-hosting? Are we doing everything? We're doing part of it?
Quick, someone write it down.
All right, I'm going to quit. That's my thing for the day. I added some value. There, I'm out.
Good job, Joe.
All right, I've reorganized the doc so that the P0s are at the top, and then it goes down from there, with the one exception that the certificate rotation to beta and TLS bootstrap to GA does not yet have a priority. If someone would like to suggest a priority for that, we can stick it in the right spot and then take a quick pass through the priorities and make sure they look right to folks.
I think we need some input from Mike on that.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess P1 or P2 in that area, but
I would like to see a P0 item of decreasing the bug count, honestly.
Okay.
Plus
the
one.
bug count of what?
On the QBD
or just just a new item, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Maybe if we cheat, we can count the bug count from before Lucas went through all the bugs the other day.
40 down already.
It just makes it slightly easier to avoid going back up. So, okay, I support that. That sounds good. So the other thing that I suggest we do next time, we don't have to do it right now, is probably turn this into a spreadsheet, but at least make sure that we have names of potential reviewers up against each piece. Either that or the people in the list will be both coders and reviewers for each piece. Because review bandwidth is just as important as coding bandwidth.
And I think we also need to identify early which of these is going to require sort of the feature effort process. Stuff like flipping on the bootstrap signer by default and the authorizer is going to be the type of thing where we want to make sure that gets a lot of eyes in discussion, because that's going to be
Yes, and the other thing we need to identify is places where we have dependencies on other SIGs. So in particular, like the self-hosting depends on SIG node. We have gotten sort of verbal agreement from Dawn, but we need to make that more explicit and make sure it gets part of their planning for the quarter, that they have what do you say? What do you say, Joe?
Trust and verify.
Yeah, I mean, but we need to they need to sign someone up to do code reviews for us, right? And make sure that's on their agenda. So the sooner we can do that more explicitly, the better.
Cool. Excellent. Sounds good. Well, I suggest that we leave it there for today then, and we come back and do another pass over this doc at the beginning of the next meeting. But this seems pretty good to me. Thank you everyone for the effort and input. Any last minute comments or other items?
I think you, Luke, were about to announce the special effort work group meeting, something. I don't know what you called it.
You're right. Thank you for reminding me. So I just suggested off the back of a conversation that several conversations we had at the leadership summit in the Bay Area last Friday, that we get a group of people together to talk about the specific implementation plans, and in particular, Lucas and Tim to talk through their designs. And so I've suggested a meeting on Friday at 10 a.m. Pacific, which a few people have accepted already. I want to make sure that that is seen as a public meeting. I will put it on Zoom. I will send a note out to the mailing list. We will keep an agenda, etc. We'll record it and so on. Just to announce that and to say that anyone who's interested is welcome to join.
I love focused design meetings. That sounds great. I won't be able to, but that sounds great.
I guess I will say one other thing that came out of the leadership meeting is that some other SIGs that are very effective have sort of their weekly or bi-weekly sort of standing meeting like this, but also breakout meetings for more focused topics. And so this is sort of the first effort to have that sort of one of those breakout meetings. And so if this becomes more common, we might want to try to block out a specific calendar block so everybody sort of knows when they shouldn't schedule other meetings, so it's not a surprise and there aren't conflicts. And this one we're just trying to get done fast. So hopefully this works for everyone who needs to be there.
Yeah.
And just one last comment as well. I'm still processing everything I learned at the Leadership Summit. It was very useful as a SIG leader. But another thing that it was recommended was to have office hours where people who, as a way of encouraging contributors. So if you're on this call and you're thinking oh, I'd like to contribute, but I haven't spoken up yet, then we would love to encourage you to get involved. And I think it makes sense to start trying to do office hours sessions to encourage contributions and so on. So I think we're over time. So thanks everyone, and see you all next week.
See ya.
Bye. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.